you have to know whether or not what you believe is true, because we do make assumptions that people want a machine in their house to make soda for $3 versus buying their own can for 25 cents, and so if you don't test those assumptions, it can lead to a lot of not just failures, but costly mistakes, probably more than failures, because we embrace failing in design thinking. But you get these mistakes because you kind of just go off on a tangent that isn't necessarily going to bring you to what the user needs. So I think that you have to test it, but it's a hard thing sometimes for people to realize, okay, what's a quick and easy way to do this? We talk about, what's low cost, what's generative, what will give us some feedback right away, but what could we do in an hour to know whether or not this design is going to work? And so the assumption is people will do what we are assuming that they'll do. They'll go and buy shoes online. Well, let's test it. So I think it's a necessary concept, but it's really hard sometimes to convey that necessity to people.
Absolutely. And I was going to talk about that same Zappos example, because I think that one is relatable. People can understand that. Zappos wasn't just born with they launched the whole website. They, had their whole supply chain figured out. They wouldn't have approached it. That would have been a very dangerous and risky way, because I think one of the assumptions that some skeptics might say is, how could I ever buy shoes online? And now look at us. Look at us all buying shoes online, right? Like, oh, but I have to try those on. But sometimes I'm narrow, and sometimes but Zappos made it so easy to do returns that it's fine. Just, turns out I'm medium. It's cool. We can just send it back. So I think that's a great relatable example that people can understand. And just in thinking a little bit more about the process of it, we have these end phases near the end of the process where we create the prototype, and then we test that prototype before we build it to scale and implement it. So it's right in this spot of prototype and test before we officially launch and build out our solution to scale, where we have hopefully this kind of rough, low fidelity prototype. That could be a digital mock-up. It could be a 3D model or something else that you can put in front of the user. And on the one hand, you test, what is their natural reaction to it? So that's one part of the test phase. But another is this idea of saying, well, I believe this solution is going to work because I assume that people will go to our website, that they will text medical questions without knowing who's reading them on the other end, right? Whatever the assumptions you have about the user, about their behavior, that your solution relies upon these things. You have to be certain that what you're assuming about how the user will respond to your product or service is actually true, not just a hunch that you have. And so we encourage teams to design a series of, we call them, as Lori I think said, $100 experiments. What are cheap, easy ways that you can really engage in some hypothesis testing, where the hypothesis is the assumption, right? People will ask a medical question over a text message, right? And then you set up some type of scenario where you have random assignment, you have people walk by the table, and then you figure out, who is comfortable with that and who isn't. And it's rarely perfectly the true experimental design where you're holding everything constant, but it's inspired by that approach of really trying to isolate the variables and figure out, do we have good data to support the fact that these assumptions or these hypotheses are valid and true. And once we get that go ahead, then we feel more comfortable investing more time and more money in building out the full solution. And then we'd probably still move into a pilot before we suddenly put this new service in 100 stores all around the country. One of the dangers, if you don't engage in this experimentation and you don't test the hypotheses or these assumptions, and you just rely on your gut that, no, we did those interviews and we had those insights and this has got to be, we're really nailing it here, this is the perfect response, and you just kind of go with your gut like that, you're in danger of another one of our favorite biases, which is called the sunk cost effect, which is when you have invested so much time and so much money and so much energy that you then kind of put blinders on and are not realistic when there are signs of failure or signs that the solution is not actually meeting the user needs. And you sort of feel like you're in too deep, sunk cost. You put so much into it that we all just have to say, yeah, no, this looks good. We're great. Everything's going perfectly. So if you do those kind of that low cost experimentation where it's low risk and low in terms of all of those resources, time and others, then you feel more comfortable pivoting, right? So psychologically you say, okay, well, we lost $400. But gosh, we could have lost millions. So it's really good that we're realizing, we got to change our design, and we may even have to, again, circle back, conduct some more interviews, do some additional types of user testing. So sunk cost is the enemy, and it is something that rears its ugly head in business as usual sometimes.
Yeah. And I think too, what often happens is assumptions are often born and bred out of a lot of experience, right? Mm-hmm. So when you face kind of similar situations over and over, and you've seen certain results, and you kind of just assume that the next time you see that situation, you're going to see the same result. And so we act based on that more than we think, okay, well, maybe it isn't, this time's going to be different. And it's really hard to convince someone that, time number 5 is going to be different from time number 4, 3, 2, 1. Yes. And so I think that's what really heightens the need for testing the assumptions, because we go too much by, I think there's a great line when you watch the tape on the Challenger incident, and you have the engineer saying, look at that shuttle's gone up 10 times and come back 10 times. We've had no problems, don't cry wolf. And time number 11 was an explosion, so, but you made the assumption because nothing had ever gone wrong, nothing would. And so I think that those are the dangers that design thinking tries to address, is that even when everything looks like it's lining up, you still got to go out and make sure that you haven't missed something, and that you're still designing something that people will actually want. And when you sit and you show them that, they interact with that prototype, it's still amazing what you get. We do storyboarding back and forth in the workshops, and people will think they had this great idea, and they'll walk the people through the different pains, like the experience of the user. And people will come and say, well, why would I do it that way? Or when I do this first, or I'm not sure I want that door versus, things that you don't think about because you're so focused, like you've come up with the right prototype based on all the information you've gathered. So I think it's essential to not only success, but to realize you may have to pivot. And nobody likes that sunk cost, right, Allison?
Early in the days where I started really aggressively pulling in a lot of practice from other design disciplines, we started working with a university in Boston that was launching a new program. The program was really radical, and they didn't want to do anything the way that things are normally done. They didn't want it to be cohort-based. They wanted it to be, meaning that everybody could progress at whatever speed they wanted it to be. They didn't want it, they wanted it to be hybrid. So there was field experience, there was classroom experience. They were also working with individual mentors. And they said, we know that we want these features, but we don't know how to get there. And the person who was driving it was this world-famous academic who had been studying this stuff and writing about models like this for a long time, but he had never done it. So when we started the work, one of the things that we were told was, this really has to be like game-based. This has to be gamified. We really want this to feel like a game. And so the first bit of research that we did, and this was a little new for us because we hadn't done really deep research with learners. So we went out, before we really did anything, we generated some initial ideas. We kind of captured all of those initial ideas that we got from the client. We literally got paper, sketched out some things on paper and photocopied them. Like, it was the lowest resolution thing we could think of on purpose. We went out there, got in front of a dozen representative learners, and every single one of them told us that they really hated the idea that it would be a game. And if we hadn't done that work, we would have taken the specs that we were given by our client. We would have spent 2 years developing the first bit of their program. They would have spent, it was a large, expensive effort, and it wasn't just us, but us and all the other resources, probably a couple $1 million putting it together. And they would have found out after 2 years of effort that they had made a bad assumption about what people wanted. So scribbling on a couple pieces of paper and going out and talking to a bunch of people, while it seems maybe in the moment, do we have time to take 5 days at the, in a tight timeline to go talk to people, saved our client millions of dollars and years of time. That story, like when we had that realization, it was like scary, to be honest with you. Like, wow, we could have fought a little less hard to do this and gone off and created something that was utterly useless. But the reality is that it wasn't our opinion. I think if we had come to him and said, the game's just not right for what you want to do, that I could have gotten us fired because he just had a deeply held belief that it was true. We were giving him data and just saying, this is what the data is. We can talk to more people. If you're not sure, we're happy to talk to more people. But this is an overwhelming response. It wasn't just a couple people. It was everybody, and they were pretty adamant in what they were saying. And he was convinced by that, because at the end of the day, these are the people that he was trying to serve. And I think a good lesson generally is that opinions is really hard to sway people with your opinions. It's much easier to sway people with not just data from the learning sciences, because people can kind of wave that off. But if you can present them with something that came from a peer of theirs or came from somebody in their target audience as a way to kind of make your case, that's usually the most powerful way to do it.